From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. As we come to air, we are waiting for an historic signing ceremony at the White House, where President Trump is going to be gathering with the Prime Minister of Israel and the foreign ministers of the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain for them to sign the agreements normalizing relations between Israel and the two Arab states on the Gulf. While we wait for that ceremony, we welcome now our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, who is at the White House. So, Kevin, as I say, it is historic. I mean, it's been 25 years since the last time any Arab nation has normalized relations with Israel. That was Jordan, of course. This is a rather big breakthrough.
Well, just moments ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arriving at the White House to meet with President Trump, and then they will, of course, have that historic signing. Earlier this morning, I spoke with Ambassador Friedman, and he really was saying that part of the arrangement and really what was able to draw and move these two Gulf Arab states toward coming to the table with normalizing ties with Israel was the opposition against Iran. Now, I also just spoke with the former ambassador to Germany and the former acting director of national intelligence, Rick Grenell. He told me that the U.S. withdrawing from the Iran nuclear disarmament deal signaled to Gulf Arab states that they were willing to stand by them in their opposition to Iran. So very much shifting geopolitical plates throughout the past several months. But for President Trump, it comes at a time in which he's looking for some type of geopolitical foreign policy win. And for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has just reimposed at least a 3-week lockdown to combat the pandemic, this is a feather in the cap, so to speak, for lack of a better phrase, for both of these leaders. Now, whether or not additional Gulf Arab states will come to the negotiating table, whether it's Morocco, Sudan, or other countries, we just don't know as of this time. But I can tell you, based upon my reporting, David, that the administration is bullish that they'll be able to deliver more states before the election.
Well, Kevin, as you suggest, it would not be the first time in history that a sitting president running for re-election likes to emphasize foreign policy if domestic it maybe isn't going quite as well as he would have liked to have gone. But at the same time, it is certainly the case that Iran appears to be a loser in this deal, without a doubt. But there are also some economic issues. I know that in your discussion with the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, he also emphasized the economy of it and the business aspects of it.
Precisely, and especially as Israel tries to embolden their technology development and looks to portions of Tel Aviv, for example, to outsource some of that technology to the Gulf Arab states. That is definitely here on the negotiating table. With regards to the UAE, the U.S. has suggested that they would be willing to sell F-35 jets to the UAE, but also China. I mean, China really is in the shadow, David, of all of these negotiations. And so by uniting and normalizing economic relations between the Gulf Arab states and Israel, it suggests that China could also be poised to lose out on some of those developments. But the bottom line here is that it offers an opportunity not just for the region to become recalibrated in opposition against Iran. It, according to Ambassador Friedman, will also put pressure on the Palestinians, who, as the ambassador put it, might be missing the train that's leaving the station.
Yeah, it really does put some pressure on Mahmoud Abbas and moving forward with the Palestinians. At the same time, let me push my luck here a little bit, Kevin. What about another shoe that might drop? And the really big one is Saudi Arabia. The president and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, have had very close relations with Saudi Arabia. Is there any thought that they might be next?
Well, two things. I asked that question to Ambassador Friedman, and he said that all of these normalizing of ties related to Saudi Arabia, and that the Saudis were crucial behind the scenes. And secondly, the Saudis took a giant step forward in terms of helping the United States as it relates to normalizing flights and allowing for that travel to go not just on a one-time flight, but all throughout for the future between Israel and the UAE. So the Saudis are definitely watching this and monitoring it closely, but no further developments about whether they are next.
Okay, thank you so much to our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli. We're going to be coming back to the White House when they get that signing ceremony going. And as Kevin mentioned, he spoke to Ambassador David Friedman, the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, earlier today, and he asked him about Saudi Arabia's role in getting the deal done.
The Saudis are also, of course, very close to Bahrain, so it's unlikely that any of this would have happened without Saudi support. The Saudis have been great from the very beginning. You know, they allowed the first commercial flight from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi. They then opened up their airspace more broadly to Israel, flying. You have no idea how much time that saves. You're talking about saving 4 hours on an 8-hour flight becomes a 4-hour flight. It opens up a lot of South Asia to Israel in ways never before. So it's really a massive opportunity. The Saudis have been terrific in making that happen.
All right, so I'm looking at the list. Sudan, Oman, Morocco. Who's going to be next?
Well, look, if I told you that you couldn't make any money betting on it, right?
Is that a good list? Is that a good list? Am I in the right?
Look, that's a good list. I think we could add to that list. I think there'll be others that are not on the list. There are a lot of countries thinking about this, thinking about how to structure it, how to do it, when to do it. But it's on almost everybody's plate right now, except maybe the EU, which has imposed a lot of discipline on its members. On the issues like Jerusalem, things like that are much more complicated in Europe. But apart from that, I think not only are we talking about normalization, I think we're talking about more nations moving their embassies to Jerusalem. I think you're just going to see Israel get to a much better place diplomatically throughout the world.
I ask this respectfully. F-35 jets to the UAE. Some Israelis have raised some concerns about that. If that sale goes through, if the F-35 jets go to UAE, how do you ensure that Israel still has its military edge in the region and doesn't, give up any security concerns?
So, look, I'm not an expert in these types of issues. I would also say that almost no one that I've spoken to is an expert as well. I think this is an issue that has been around as a legal matter since 2008. Aspirationally, it's been around probably for 40 years. The way this gets dealt with, the experts sit in a room and they work this thing out. There are, I would say, a dozen ways to skin the cat to make sure that Israel maintains its QME. But the people that really know it and know the issues, they don't really talk about it publicly. But I have no doubt that Israel's QME will be preserved. I also have no doubt that there is a way for the Emirates to improve their defense capabilities.
There was a report a few days ago about the U.S. promising the UAE that it would not be backing annexation before 2024.
Yeah, I don't know where that came from.
And then as it relates to Chinese, so can you just clarify then the U.S.-Israeli position on annexation?
Look, the position is that we've asked Israel to suspend it. They've agreed to. They will work in conjunction with us to put it back on the table. We're focusing right now on booking as many peace agreements as we can, and I think when we've exhausted that opportunity, we'll revisit the issue of annexation. We don't have a hard time frame on it, but it will be delayed certainly as a result of this process.
Just two more questions. Sure. As it relates to Chinese investment, because the U.S. has raised some concerns about Chinese investment in some pretty sensitive Israeli infrastructure. Do you think the Emirati investment infrastructure might be a replacement to some of that, to that thorny issue?
I think you're absolutely onto something there. It's better capital. It's safer capital. I think it's more reliable capital. I don't think it comes with as many strings attached or as many risks. And I think it's a great opportunity for Israel to maintain the sources of capital it needs without putting itself, its security, or frankly our security at risk.
That was U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman speaking earlier with our colleague Kevin Cirilli. Up next, we're going to stay at the White House. We're going to turn from foreign affairs to domestic issues involving the economy and get the take from Tyler Goodspeed. He's the acting chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors on the present state of the U.S. economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. On Capitol Hill, it is a long-shot attempt to break that deadlock over another coronavirus relief bill. A 50-member group of House Democrats and Republicans will unveil a $1.5 trillion stimulus package today. It offers compromises on two of the thorniest issues, aid to state and local governments and supplemental unemployment insurance. President Trump said he did want to assassinate Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, contradicting his earlier denial on the subject. The president told Fox News today, quote, "I would have rather taken him out." The president says he doesn't regret his decision not to move forward with the killing, but faulted former Secretary of Defense James Mattis. A book written by journalist Bob Woodward in 2018 said Mr. Trump urged Mattis to come up with a plan to kill Assad. At the time, the president called the book total fiction. The World Trade Organization says the United States violated international rules when it imposed tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018. While today's ruling bolsters Beijing's claims that President Trump's trade war skirted WTO rules, Washington can effectively veto the decision by lodging an appeal at any point in the next 60 days. The U.S. has imposed levies on more than $550 billion worth of Chinese exports. Alexei Navalny returned to social media today for the first time since he was poisoned last month. He posted a picture of himself from his hospital bed in Germany, joking about his condition and saying he could finally breathe on his own. The fierce critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin became sick on a Russian flight. German doctors say he was poisoned by a Soviet-era nerve agent. Officials say Navalny plans to return to Russia once he has fully recovered. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. As we continue to wait for that signing ceremony at the White House, we turn now to the U.S. economy. It has begun to recover from the recession triggered by the pandemic, but the rate of that recovery appears that it may be slowing. Welcome now one of President Trump's key economic aides. He is Tyler Goodspeed, acting chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. So, Dr. Goodspeed, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get to where we are right now and where we're going, I know we got a report out of the Census Bureau just today on the income of Americans and also the poverty level before the pandemic, where we were last year. You want to give us a summary of that? Because it was pretty good news.
Sure. Thank you, David. Yes, today the Census Bureau released its estimates of income, poverty, and health insurance coverage in 2019. And this was just an absolutely stunning report. To be honest, I've not seen numbers like this before. So real median household income in 2019 rose $4,400 to an all-time high. It was the biggest percentage increase in the series history. And what's most notable is that not only was this the biggest percentage increase and biggest dollar increase in the series history, but those increases were across the board. So this was also the biggest dollar increase and percentage increase for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for Asian Americans, for white Americans, with the biggest gains for ethnic and racial minorities. So this was just a blockbuster report. And it now takes the total gains in median real household income since 2017 tax legislation to $4,900. That's almost $5,000. And I think the other key thing that we noted in this report was that for the second year in a row following tax reform in 2017, we saw income inequality in the United States decline. This was after a protracted period in the preceding expansion of rising income inequality. And for the second year in a row, we saw that decline. So as you note, this is a testament not to the current state of the economy, but to the state of the economy on the eve of the worst macroeconomic shock it has experienced in 90 years. And definitely our focus is about how to get back to that state of affairs as quickly as possible.
Well, exactly. It was a really good 2019. Now the question is where we go from here. And as I said, I think it's fair to say we went into a recession. We bounced back from that some in May and June. There are some indications that's slowing a bit. Let's talk about just the here and now. There's this chasm over the so-called Phase 4 fiscal stimulus between the Democrats and the Republicans up on Capitol Hill. Today we had the so-called Problem Solvers Caucus of both Democrats and Republicans in the House propose a compromise in between. What is the White House position on that compromise? Does it make sense? Because it seems to pretty much split the baby down the middle.
Well, so we've definitely been encouraged in recent months by the fact that we've clawed back 50% of the job losses in March and April. And that wasn't easy to do. The reason that we were able to hire back so many workers in such short order was because so many of those layoffs were temporary. The Council of Economic Advisors estimated that 80% of the layoffs in March and April were expected to be temporary. That temporary nature of those layoffs was precisely because we responded swiftly with a paycheck protection program, with an employee retention tax credit, with enhanced unemployment insurance to make sure that laid off workers had income support while they were laid off. And the job gains in May, June, July, and August were reflective of the ability of firms to rehire employees that they had temporarily laid off. So as we look at a Phase 4 legislation, we're definitely keen on a reload of the Paycheck Protection Program and other measures to support small businesses. We are very keen on a continuation of enhanced unemployment insurance benefits to support unemployed Americans so we don't have a collapse in household spending. And we are very keen on a second round of economic impact payments to make sure that the most vulnerable households, those earning under $75,000 a year, have an additional income support during this unprecedented period. And that's why we were encouraged to see bipartisan action in the House, and we really, really hope that this puts pressure on House leadership to act.
So on the supplemental unemployment insurance, as I understand it, the proposal is $450 a week for 8 weeks for a specific period of time rather than $600 indefinitely. What's your reaction to that? Does that seem like a reasonable approach, $450 a week for 8 weeks?
I think $450 a week for 8 weeks is doing a much better job at striking the right balance between income replacement on the one hand and not having unduly high implicit marginal tax rates on the return to work. And the 8-week limitation additionally allows us, or would allow us, to calibrate those supplements as the recovery proceeds, because the optimal rate of income replacement or income supplementation is going to be a dynamic thing. It's going to change over the course of a recovery. So if the recovery gathers pace, then we can dial that down. If the recovery is slower than we would hope, then we can dial that up.
And what about the support for state and local government? As I understand it, the Republicans basically were offering $100 billion. The Democrats were close to $1 trillion, something like $900 billion and change. Now they're talking about something like $500 billion. Does that make sense? Something around $500 billion.
So in the CARES Act, Phase 3, we offered state and local governments $150 billion in aid, plus an additional $50 billion from other mechanisms, other programs. Much of that still remains. And in addition to that, the White House has previously offered $150 billion in top-up support. And we have not ruled out the possibility of going back, revisiting this question if more is needed. I can say that when we have looked at estimates of the state and local funding shortfall based on past experiences of declines in GDP and by how much revenues decline as a result, the $1 trillion number is just not a plausible number. It doesn't belong in the conversation whatsoever.
What about the protection from liability? As an economic matter, is that important as you take a look at the numbers? Is it important to give some safe harbor, if I can call it that, for employers and workers coming back?
Yes, the president is very keen on some degree of protection for businesses reopening to make sure that they don't face punitive non-economic damages for things that they can't control for. So we do view some degree of liability protection as an important component of a safe recovery and a successful recovery.
Tyler, you don't do legislative affairs. You're the National Economic Council. At the same time, are you optimistic at all that we could actually get this thing done and signed by the end of the month?
The economic logic is unmistakable. This would be highly desirable from a recovery perspective, in particular from a labor market recovery perspective. If we can get a reload of the Paycheck Protection Program and additional hiring incentives for small businesses and additional support for businesses to reopen. In terms of the political calculus, I can't speak to that. I can only say that we hope that this bipartisan movement places pressure on House leadership to recognize that the American economy should come first.
Okay, Dr. Goodspeed, I really appreciate you spending time with us. It was very helpful. That's Tyler Goodspeed. He is acting chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Still ahead, we are still waiting for that historic signing ceremony between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain at the White House. We're going to bring you that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We continue to wait for Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain to sign that historic Abraham Accords at the White House, normalizing relations between those Arab countries and Israel. Let's bring in now Bill Ferries, who leads Bloomberg's national security coverage in Washington. So, Bill, you know this area of the world so well. You know all the strife that has been there. What does this do? How does it really shake up the playing cards in the Middle East?
Well, it really shows, I think, some of the shifting political dynamics in the region, that you have two more countries officially recognizing Israel. It's the kind of achievement I think any administration, Republican or Democrat, in the past would have loved to have had. And it shows, growing concern about Iran in the region. It also, frankly, shows a concern that the region needs to be more unified over questions about the U.S. commitment to the Middle East. President Trump has long said he wants to get out of intractable conflicts in the region. A lot of Americans on both parties agree with the need to get out of places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And so there is a recognition in the region as well that they need to form some new alliances that maybe in the 20th century weren't appropriate, but in the 21st century seem well primed to help them address some of the challenges that are coming.
Iran cannot be very happy with these developments. To what extent are they being put in a corner by a combination now of Israel plus some of the Arab countries?
They are certainly being left behind here. Iran and the Palestinians, I think, are the two losers on this. Iran has to be looking around the region with increasing alarm. It was already kind of with its back against the wall, with the Saudis trying to lead a regional alliance against them. But to actually see countries taking the next step and recognizing Israel and beginning to open commercial diplomatic relations, that's a huge leap for the region. And particularly, we haven't talked a ton about Bahrain's role in this, but Bahrain is, like Iran, a Shiite majority country. And so for Iran to see Bahrain joining, that's actually in some ways as significant or more significant than the UAE move.
Well, it's a fascinating point you make because, as you say, Bahrain is a Shia majority country, although the Sunni minority have been ruling it. There have been real strife there in Bahrain over that. Is the leadership, is the king actually of Bahrain taking some risks here?
Certainly. And I think, when people talk about the next steps and, which countries might be next, and that conversation always turns to the Saudis and when will they consider something like this. I think the Saudis may be giving their blessing behind the scenes to all this, but they're going to be much more cautious in terms of seeing how it plays out with the population in a place like Bahrain and the UAE before they really decide to take what would be a politically potentially explosive step of following these countries into some sort of a deal. Yeah. There may be a lot of behind-the-scenes diplomacy that goes on, but for the Saudis, the keepers of the holy sites of Islam, to go ahead and do that, I think that's going to be a ways off.
That sounds exactly right. Thank you so much to Bill Ferries, who leads our Bloomberg national security coverage in Washington, and we'll come back to the White House shortly. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We continue to wait for the White House, where we're going to have that signing ceremony, historic signing ceremony, to normalize relations between Israel on the one hand and the UAE and Bahrain on the other. We'll bring you that as it comes. But in the meantime, earlier, our colleague Eric Schatzker sat down with Bill Gates, of course, of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One of the things they talked about was this rush for a vaccine and whether there were concerns about whether politics might interfere with the process.
Well, that would be a tragedy. And any suggestion that a politician, helped create the vaccine or it's faster because of a politician is a very dangerous thing. We saw with the completely bungled plasma statements that, when you start pressuring people to say optimistic things, they go completely off the rails. And so the FDA lost a lot of credibility there. Thank goodness the companies are saying that the FDA's open-mindedness to be asked for an emergency use license before there's efficacy data. They're not going to seek that shortcut.
Do you still trust the FDA?
I think in the FDA, there's a lot of professionals. Historically, just like the CDC was viewed as the best in the world, the FDA had that same reputation as a top-notch regulator. But, there's been some cracks with some of the things they've said at the commissioner level. Hopefully the staff isn't pulled in that direction.
So it sounds to me like you're harboring perhaps some reservations What about the CDC? You made reference to the reputational damage that's been done to the CDC. Can you take what the CDC says to the bank any longer?
Well, the CDC is largely being written out of the picture because you have people at the White House who aren't epidemiologists, saying what a great job they've done, and so it's no longer a set of experts. The CDC actually did make some mistakes, the way they thought about testing, the way they hadn't figured out to bring the commercial providers in. There's a number of countries like South Korea who got that testing going very well. And we're very clear that if the result takes more than 24 hours, you don't reimburse for that. It's got to be a timely result.
One of the big risks in politicization is public confidence. Polls show a third of Americans will refuse to get vaccinated, and a majority of Americans believe a vaccine is being rushed. Has the damage already been done?
I hope not. These companies are very professional, and the benefits of the vaccine here are very dramatic. After all, not just on the health front, but the economic front, the education front, we need to bring this pandemic to a close. And thank goodness that we have this private sector expertise that we want to shape into a global public good that gets to everybody on the planet. I think some people won't be in the first wave to take the vaccine. They may take a wait and see attitude, but I do think over time we will be able to get to the majority of the population to get to a level where the transmission slows down very dramatically.
Americans, and for that matter, Bill, citizens of the world, have been put in this awkward position where they may find themselves more trusting of what they hear from the private sector, from the companies developing these vaccines, as opposed to what they hear from this government or perhaps other governments. Given the accelerated timeline on which these vaccines are being developed, how confident are you that they'll be not just effective, but safe as well?
Well, these vaccines are going through this phase 3 trial where you look at the efficacy and you look at all the medical records to see if there's any adverse events. The companies have their reputations. Many of these companies are doing this on a not-for-profit basis, so there's not some big profit upside to many of the companies involved, including the ones that will have the most scalable, low-cost vaccines, which is 4 of the leading 6 companies here. So, vaccines are complex. There's often rare side effects, even for the vaccines that have dramatic net benefit. We're all going to be looking at the data, but a safe vaccine, I think, is very likely to come out of this R&D work.
That was Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates speaking earlier with Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says Congress should stay in session until lawmakers and the White House get an agreement on another stimulus package. Speaker Pelosi says Democratic lawmakers are committed to staying until there is an agreement. There are multiple hurdles in front of any deal. Democrats have shown no signs of backing away from their $2.2 trillion package. Some Senate Republicans have rejected any stimulus approaching even half that. Thailand is making plans to reopen its doors to tourists and salvage its most important industry. The country's cabinet has approved a plan to issue special renewable 90-day plans. Under the plan, visitors would quarantine for 14 days and show proof they've made arrangements for long-term accommodations. Health officials reported 5 new cases today from people arriving from abroad. The European Union is warning its relations with Turkey are at a, quote, watershed moment. The EU is pressing Turkey to stop its controversial energy exploration in the eastern Mediterranean. And it says it fully backs Greece and Cyprus in their dispute with Turkey over its natural gas hunt in waters claimed by both countries. The Turkish-Greek dispute has sparked concerns about a military confrontation between the 2 NATO members. Hurricane Sally is threatening to bring extreme flooding that could inflict $5 billion in damage and losses across Mississippi, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle, even as the storm's winds drop ahead of landfall. Forecasters say Sally's path has shifted east, which reduces the chance of New Orleans taking a direct hit, but leaves open the possibility for widespread flooding across the U.S. South. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, we're going to continue our study of the key swing state of Arizona as we talk with Congressman David Schweikert, Republican of Arizona. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The Democratic Party in Arizona has historically tried to work with the civil rights issues and the humanitarian issues within the Hispanic population. And so I think there's a good, solid ground baseline here. But, you can't, this is an election that's going to be pivotal, and you can't take it for granted.
That was Congressman Tom O'Halloran, Democrat of Arizona, discussing Latino report for his party ahead of the November election. For more perspective on this critical swing state, we welcome another member of the Arizona delegation. He's Republican Representative David Schweikert of Arizona. And Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. I'm just going to interrupt us for a moment because news is intervening. We're just breaking across the Bloomberg right now. The Republican Senator John Thune says that the Fed nominee Shelton does not have the votes for confirmation at the Federal Reserve. So we'll bring you more on that as it develops. So I apologize, Congressman, but news always takes precedence, But let's come back to Arizona. You heard here what a fellow member of your Arizona delegation, albeit a Democrat, said about the Latino vote. How critical is the Latino vote in the state of Arizona?
It's important in the state of Arizona. You have to actually sort of understand concentration of where some of the population lives, but also be very, very careful on stereotyping Latino voters. You have many of those who've been in Arizona since statehood and, are Republicans, are even a few that I know that are libertarians, many that are active in the Democrat side. I want to say this nicely, but it's a certain arrogance that often comes out of Washington, where you categorize populations and say they all act like a monolith. And that just has not been the history in Arizona. And my simple example is think of the last 20, 25 years when we've been hearing about the Hispanic Latino wave that would take over Arizona. And yet, turns out many of the Latino state legislators, office holders turned out to be Republicans.
And certainly, particularly in the Latino community, as I understand it, I don't claim to be an expert at all. If you take a look at Latinos in Florida, it's very, very different from Latinos in Arizona. Put aside the fact there are differences even within Arizona, I'm sure. But what is it that the Republicans particularly have to offer to Latinos?
I think actually a combination of opportunity and some culture. There's much of the Hispanic community in the Phoenix area that I represent, the Scottsdale, North Phoenix area. The economy before COVID was joyful. It was some of the fastest growing wages in modern economic history. Employment had been very, very strong in the Hispanic community, some of the record numbers for Arizona. And then some of the cultural aspects, family, faith, those of us who are Catholic, there's some bonding. And there becomes actually the wedge that often is happening between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats have reached out and done a terrific job talking to the Hispanic community, but Republicans are actually offering solutions to them.
Give us a sense of Maricopa County, because as I understand it, I'm learning the state here. As Maricopa County goes, basically so goes the state. It's so big. It's such a substantial part of the state. At the same time, I've read that there's been something of a shift over the years. If you look, for example, in 2018, there was more of a shift, perhaps, to Democrats. Is there a shift, particularly on issues like immigration?
David, it's a powerful observation. Arizona may be the most urbanized state in the country. It's because it's a very large state, but most of the land is held by the federal government or tribal communities. So about 64% of the state's population lives in one county. 2018 was an anomaly. The Democrats did a masterful job at turnout. So when you actually look at the numbers, you need to adjust for they had a bigger than a presidential year on an off year turnout. So if you normalize saying, okay, here we are back into normal politics, and this is where a lot of the pollsters in Arizona are having great difficulty building their models. They're using a blend of 2018, 2016, not adjusting for the undervote of Republicans in 18 and the fairly substantial overvote of Democrats in 18.
So look ahead to November 3rd here, if you would, and maybe after, depending on how long it takes to count the votes.
Yeah.
Whether it's in your race, because you're running as a congressman, or all the way up to the presidency, what are the main issues, do you believe, for voters in Arizona?
For Arizona, I'm not going to be an expert, but I can give you some really good estimations. We've done some pretty extensive polling in the North Phoenix, North Scottsdale area. We found some of the traditional issues of economics, dealing with COVID, job opportunities, but we also saw some other things bounce off the page. A passionate desire for normality. And that normality meant my kids going to school, getting back to life again. And so if that holds up true, I'm in absolute belief that the message coming from the more conservative side of the ledger actually satiates those desires.
What about the coronavirus and the response to the coronavirus, whether at federal level or state level? As I understand it, your governor took a somewhat different approach, really allowed a fair amount of leeway for localities to decide exactly how much shutting down they did or not.
Yeah, and you actually see it has worked. What you actually found is if you were willing to actually take a step backwards and look at the data, we had a real spike of COVID a couple months ago, but it was in concentrated areas. So you had to deal with this concept. Do you do blanket lockdowns, blanket shutting down of certain businesses, or do you concentrate on where the areas have problems? And in concert with the federal government, those of us here in Congress, the state, the county, there was lots of testing done in the areas, even drive-through testing in the areas that had the hot spots. And you're actually seeing it's worked. Our numbers are very manageable now. We've hit many of the matrix. So you're seeing the opportunity for businesses, gyms, schools to be able to begin opening. And you can almost feel the renaissance in the community as normality. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be difficulties. But there is a sense that normality is on the cup's edge.
Congressman, we all are mindful of the terrible conflagration in Northern California and Oregon right now. And I know that Arizona historically has been somewhat an outdoor state, if I can say that, concern about the environment and things like that. Is that going to be a large issue, do you think, as it turns out in this election, given what we're seeing right now?
Look, environment should always be a key issue. But it turns out if you're going to deal with it like an adult, it's more complicated. So, but there's so many things that are happening around us. You think of the stress economically, the desire for normality, those things going on. Some of the traditional environmental conversation seems to have been surpassed by those needs. But think of Arizona. We've also had some tremendous wildfires over the last decade. But it turns out, if you actually look at the postmortem of those fires, someone that stands up and says it's global warming, or the individual that stands up and says it's solely forest management, it turns out it's more complicated. For us in Arizona, we have many forests that had not been thinned or managed in decades after decades after decades. But other things you wouldn't have thought of, types of grasses that are not native to us in the southwest. And people don't realize a substantial portion of Arizona is a ponderosa pine forest. And yet the ground cover are now grasses that aren't native, and that ground cover burns. So we desperately need updated and investment in that forest management.
It's fascinating. I really appreciate it. This is really helping us in our tutelage, basically, about the state of Arizona. It's great. Congressman David Schweikert, Republican of Arizona. Thanks. Please come back again. Now we want to go back to that breaking news as we continue to keep an eye on the White House and that signing ceremony. In the meantime, Senator John Thune, says that the Fed nominee Judy Shelton lacks the votes for confirmation. Michael McKee is with us now. So, Michael, he says that at the same time, he says when they do have the 51 votes, they expect to vote on it. So I don't know exactly what this means.
It means probably that she's not going to get a vote this year. John Thune is the number 2 Senate Republican, and so his words carry a lot of weight. The problem for Judy Shelton and her nomination is that there's only about half a month to go, 15 days or so, until the end of September, when Congress is supposed to adjourn for the election. And it isn't clear yet there will be a lame duck session after the election. That may depend on whether they pass a bill to a continuing resolution to finance the government that only lasts until December or not. But once Congress has adjourned essentially for the year, then the nomination dies, as does the other nomination for the Fed, and they would have to be resubmitted. Now, if President Trump is reelected, that could happen. If he is not, then it is very likely that at least Judy Shelton's nomination will go away.
So for some of us who may not follow this quite as closely as you do, Mike, remind us about Judy Shelton. She's been an advisor, sort of economic advisor to the president. The president seems to be very enthusiastic about her. At the same time, the Senate Finance Committee had a little more doubts about it, as I recall. They were a little bit more lukewarm. She seems to be a little outside the mainstream, can I call it?
That's a good way of putting it, I suppose. Judy Shelton, of course, the main criticism of her is that she's been a longtime advocate of the gold standard, and that is not seen as viable by any mainstream economist these days. She did renounce that as an issue during her confirmation hearings. She was also someone who wanted tighter money, wanted higher interest rates to head off what she viewed as inflation likely coming down the line, until she was nominated. And then she changed her mind and said she supports the president's call for very low rates. So people on the Finance Committee, Banking Committee actually, were kind of concerned about whether she whether she believed in what she was saying.
So there's another nominee up as well, right? Where does that stand?
Yes, he's the St. Louis Fed research director, Christopher, and I'm spacing on the last name. I'll think of it in just a second. But anyway, his nomination, as far as everybody knows, is going forward. He's uncontroversial. And the Senate probably just has them packaged together. So the question is, would they shake his nomination loose because nobody had any real objections to him going forward?
Yeah, it's fascinating. In the meantime, does this affect what the Fed is doing at all? I mean, they're actually, FOMC is having a meeting as we speak, I believe, right, with a decision coming out tomorrow. Is this affecting the business of the Fed?
Not Judy Shelton, but the fact that they are shorthanded. The Fed does a lot of things besides just set monetary policy. It's an actual very big business. And so each of the Fed governors has a role in running the operation. And so the 5 who are left have had to do a lot more work because they haven't had a full complement. But this is not unusual. It's been since 2013 that we had a full complement of 7 governors. Neither President Obama or President Trump has managed to fill up the Fed seats.
Mike, we have such an advantage in having you because you've covered the Fed for so many years. You understand it well as Washington. Those of us at Bloomberg follow who's on the Fed, who's not on the Fed, what do they think, what are they eating for lunch very closely because we're so concerned about interest rates and quantitative easing and things. What is it for members of Congress? I mean, are there many members of Congress, Senate or House, who really pay much attention to this at all?
Yes, there are. And one of the reasons is that the Fed has an impact on their constituents' lives. What there isn't is a lot of understanding of how the Fed works. You get a lot of questions that don't make a lot of sense when they have their hearings. But in terms of banking regulation, local banks, a lot of members of Congress care about that. And obviously they care about the idea that the Fed keep interest rates as low as possible from a politician's standpoint, but also from the standpoint that Jay Powell has advanced, that the lower for longer regime has enabled more people on the margins to get jobs, or at least it did until the pandemic hit. And so they have followed this closely, and Powell recognized this when he came to office, and he has spent a lot of time up on the Hill meeting with just about anybody who would talk to him about the Fed.
Yeah, we continue to watch the White House now as Melania Trump, the First Lady, is walking out for this signing ceremony. I think that President Trump must be having a good time with Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, as well as foreign ministers for UAE and for Bahrain. We'll bring you that when it comes. Mike, I do want to take advantage of you because we are going to get a FOMC decision tomorrow. As a practical matter, are we expecting anything at all? Because last meeting they sort of changed the regime, said we're willing to tolerate higher interest rate. We're going to have interest rate averaging, things like that. Inflation averaging, I beg your pardon. Do we expect anything coming out tomorrow really at all?
Not really. There's certainly going to be no change in interest rates. The statement is going to have to acknowledge maybe a little improvement in the economy since the last time they met. But the question is whether they would give us a different kind of forward guidance, put any kind of time frame on when they would consider raising interest rates. And the general impression on Wall Street is we're not going to get that now. Most members of the Fed have said they don't think it needs to be done now since the economy is still struggling to get ahead. We'll also get new economic projections, and we'll see whether they think the economy is going to be as bad as they had thought or whether they take into account some improvement.
Mike, if the activity is not going to be at the monetary end of the spectrum, what about the fiscal end of the spectrum? Because now we have this new proposal of the Problem Solvers Caucus, as they call themselves, which is a compromise on fiscal stimulus. We just talked with Tyler Goodspeed from the White House saying, he could go along with an awful lot of that deal.
Well, the president would go along with a lot of the deal, it appears. The question is, do Senate Republicans want to? Can Mitch McConnell get enough Republicans who would pass up on the idea of cutting the budget deficit?
Mike, I'm going to go right to the White House now. President Trump is speaking.
Thank you, Sarah. And Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed, United Arab Emirates, UAE, thank you very much. And Foreign Minister Abdulaziz Al Zani of Bahrain, thank you. Thank you very much. We're here this afternoon to change the course of history. After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East. Thanks to the great courage of the leaders of these three countries, we take a major stride toward a future in which people of all faiths and backgrounds live together in peace and prosperity. In a few moments, these visionary leaders will sign the first two peace deals between Israel and the Arab state in more than a quarter century. In Israel's entire history, there have previously been only two such agreements. Now we have achieved two in a single month, and there are more to follow. Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain will establish embassies, exchange ambassadors, and begin the cooperate and work together so strongly to cooperate as partners across the broad range of sectors, from tourism to trade and healthcare to security. They're going to work together. They are friends. The Abraham Accords also opened the door for Muslims around the world to visit the historic sites in Israel and to peacefully pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam. Together, these agreements will serve as the foundation for a comprehensive peace across the entire region, something which nobody thought was possible, certainly not in this day and age, maybe in many decades from now, but one founded on shared interests, mutual respect, and friendship. To our honored guests from Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, congratulations on this outstanding achievement. Congratulations. Fantastic. I also want to thank Vice President Mike Pence. Thank you, Mike. Great job. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mike, thank you very much. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Robert, thank you. Mr. Jared Kushner. Jared, thank you very much. Ambassador Brian Hook. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you. Thank you. And Avi Berkowitz. Avi, thank you very much. I also want to give a very special thanks. He's been an incredible ambassador to Israel. David Friedman. That's a very great group of people, great group of patriots. They wanted this to happen so badly. They worked so hard. And again, nobody thought it could happen, and they thought it could happen. They never even doubted it. So I want to thank you all very much. Thank you. For generations, the people of the Middle East have been held back by old conflicts, hostilities, lies, treacheries. So many things held them back. Actually, lies that the Jews and Arabs were enemies and that Al-Aqsa Mosque was under attack. Constantly, they would say it was under attack. These lies passed down from generation to generation, fueled a vicious cycle of terror and violence that spread across the region and all over the world. These agreements prove that the nations of the region are breaking free from the failed approaches of the past.